Draphel's Day, the goddess of joy, the lady of delight, romance, and enduring love, the goddess of devotion and understanding. 2. Therio Tailors. RE Instructions. Please find enclosed the following. Jacket. Remove brown stains, coffee, red stains, blood, human, and blue stains, blood, Shilvanti. Pants. Remove green stains, grass, and repair torn seat. Shirt. Repair torn cuff and rend in collar. Yours respectfully, Tom Warwick Pellavon. Earlier. As the crowd waited to file from the temple, murmurs of conversation echoed through the hall, a tide of sound at the edge of clarity. Solana held onto Eli's hand, standing close and smirking at curious women who looked his way, exulting in their envy when she'd heard it.
Levi, I want to have a baby.
Solana watched, dumbstruck, as Melody and Riala formed a solid front on Levi. Levi blinked, nodded slowly, then took their hands and pulled them close, their expressions a broad range of emotions as they whispered to each other. She couldn't hear over the crowd, but even so. Deep inside, she started to fume.
So what if they have a baby?
She had no reason to be upset, but there it was. And it wasn't anger, as such. She felt no flame of indignation. There was no one to argue with, no one to confront. There wasn't a single solitary thing to be said as Levi shimmied over towards his parents to collect Joshua and Cassandra.
So what if that makes 3?
As the crowd of guests began filing out and walking to the reception, she told herself not to. When Warwick's fuzzy menace was joined by 3 others, she blanched. It had been them at the arena. She was positive. The knot in her chest grew tighter, but when the 4 of them loped off with a male?
Even they have a guy.
The wedding was supposed to be a modest affair, but the temple was packed to the walls. Being part of the wedding party meant being able to slip inside, straight to the second row. She'd had a wonderful view of the whole ceremony, but leaving was another matter. The wedding party had slipped out, and now first in meant waiting to leave. And so she did, holding on to Eli, listening to the small talk, while her co-mother, Phrysis, spoke to Duchess Trinia and Princess Laurel, and tried not to hyperventilate. Normally she'd be looking too. He wasn't just some scion's son, he was the prince. But given her mood, she couldn't care less. Try as she might to distract herself, the cold, hard lump in her chest refused to let go. It was galling, infuriating even.
So what if Riala wants to have a baby? Why should I care? I shouldn't care. Why do I care?
It had been one thing when Trixis married. Everyone had expected that. Her mothers had planned for years, with Phrysis going on about the advantages of the match, and it was a good pairing between their houses. But honestly, when Trixis finally left, it came as a welcome relief. Living together had turned into one giant pain in the tits. Trixis would inherit Phrysis' title, and that was all part of the plan too. Mother Phrysis called it the Imperial Way, how things were done. Run-of-the-mill, as Eli sometimes said, and while she'd never had a good explanation for how the phrase came about, the meaning was abundantly clear. It was how things were, and you just accepted it. But then, Riala got married. It wasn't unexpected. After all, they'd met Levi and Eli together, and she'd watched them grow closer and closer. They were good together, and while there had been some bumps and bruises, she'd watched as their marriage became inevitable. And so what? Riala was happily settled down, but to humans, not Shilvanti. She liked Levi and Melody, but on a planet with so many men, it somehow felt like it shouldn't count. Like, well, it wasn't cheating, but if she got passed over, it felt wrong. Rhi had it bad for her spouses. There was no doubt it was a real marriage, but she'd told herself it shouldn't matter. Riala hadn't skipped the proper arrangements. She'd settled on a quiet, loving, caring guy. Even when Melody had twins and Riala became a co-mother, it hadn't seemed real. Not that you'd know from how her mothers acted. Grandparent fever stole over all four of them, and if they were barely younger than Lagos, that just made it worse. Somehow? It wasn't like she hadn't had her fun. She'd had sex. Lots and lots and lots of sex. Some women never got a guy, but she'd had more sex in a few years than some saw in a lifetime. She lived on Earth, settled into one of the first green zones, and could have sex whenever she wanted. Once Eli got his place, she could have sex for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. She was the lucky one. Walking out of the church and spotting the gaggle of people chasing after Warwick and his wives did nothing to her mood. Somehow the spectacle only made it worse. This wasn't Earth, it was Shil. The goddess knew her mothers went on about how wonderful everything was, and it was sort of nice seeing places she distantly remembered. But it kind of wasn't. As much as she enjoyed her father enjoying himself, she knew how she felt. She remembered Shil, but it just wasn't her home. Solana knew perfectly well she was getting worked up over nothing, but the gulf between understanding and feeling yawned wide as an ocean.
So what if it was all different? So what if our weddings are out of order? And so what if my mothers looked my way when someone started moaning, like they had to check?
Big deal. So she'd had her fun for, well, a while now. Years, even. She was the envy of every non-human girl who settled in town, and that didn't mean she couldn't be respectable. It was unfair. It was just...
Why do I suddenly feel like I'm getting left behind? Eli?
She squeezed out and took hold of his wrist, pulling him close. Yeah? Jeez, mind the grip, huh? Eli gave her a sharp look as he shook his arm loose. What's up? She leaned in close, whispering in his ear.
Eli, you remember the other night when we said we'd take care of each other? Right?
The words sounded more like a demand, which was fine. They were. Eli had said a lot of things that night, and it seemed like he meant every word. But it was Eli. They'd had a lot to drink, and it never hurt to check. And it was Eli. And she'd been upset.
All thanks to those furry bitches.
She looked at him, needing to be sure.
Goddess, if he bails out on me now, I swear I'll drop him on the altar and kill him. And then I'd kill me.
I didn't drink that much. Eli shook off her hand, but slipped his fingers into hers. Well, maybe I did, but sure. I remember.
And you meant every word about us looking out for each other from now on? No more goofing around, didn't you?
Pretty much.
Pretty much?
No, I mean, sure, I remember. And yeah, I meant it. Stop staring at me like that. What's the big deal? Eli cocked his head to one side. You seem kind of upset.
I'm not upset,
she whispered back firmly, tucking his arm fully in hers as the crowd started to move. Eli grimaced but didn't let go. Yeah, 'cause your nostrils always flare when everything's peachy.
It's fine, she said.
Each word ground out like they were carved in stone.
Definitely. We'll just be seen at the reception, then go home, where we're going to talk about the future. It will be a lovely day, followed by a perfect night. Okay?
Sure. He sounded uncertain, but got the hint as her scowl descended on him like a typhoon. Yeah, sure. Magical evening. Cheese, whatever you want, no problem. Let's just hit the buffet first. I'm starving. Lady Tarnis, can you give us some words? Mr. Pelavon, are you on the market for a fourth wife? Lady Pelavon, would you like to say something as matriarch? Tom felt his grip tighten on his sword as the mob of reporters edged in, shouting questions. Out of some inborn courtesy, none of the gaggle seemed to get in the way of Lark, Nesfa and Bree, giving the trio room to film the wedding video, But that didn't stop the barrage of asinine questions raining down from all sides. It was a short walk from the temple to their reception area, which was just as well. It felt like the short walk was shaping into a forced march. Drawing the sword was tempting. He refused to run. Besides, he'd never brandished a sword before. He didn't know when he would again. It seemed like a missed opportunity. But no. Tom felt his teeth grind like tectonic plates, but forced himself to smile. As a first human, he'd done his best. Shown humanity's good side. Set an example. He felt dressed to kill, sword and all. This would blow over in a few minutes. Besides, there was one blessing to the departure. As Lady Desari emerged with Bodin, Brelak, and some noble couple, the questions died off. The new pair wore more jewellery than a De Beers mine, and looked good in it. The guy put his suit to shame, but the silence was a welcome relief. The news is still filmed, but the other couple instead. I'll find out later. Introduce myself or something. Miv or Ganya will know who they are. But Ganya lingered behind, and a glance Miv's way did not provide its usual comfort. She stared ahead like her life depended on it, while Shalea had gone pale. The only one who seemed comfortable was Lani. Radiant in her dress breastplate, she was grinning from ear to ear. It's fine. Ganya doesn't usually allow reporters on the grounds, but school's out, and there's more nobles here than I want to think about. She probably had no choice. No big deal. The Tower will provide. It wasn't as if the universe had to provide much. It was just a short walk from the cathedral to the reception. With the reporters stilled, it couldn't be that bad. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Shakespeare might have imagined a setting like this, but something from A Midsummer Night's Dream with its cast of fairies and impossible situations, but the line from The Tempest felt more apt. It was all a case of understanding the Shovanti for what they were. One difficulty was that the Shovanti tended to be literal. Not just straightforward with a little give. More like God's gift to literal. Flowery and fun, brooding or base, the Shovanti had ample imagination. That wasn't the problem. It had been invisible on Earth. The Shovanti remodeled government and civic institutions, but the shape of things remained the same. Landmarks and institutions largely retained their familiar aspects. Most of all, the name stayed unchanged. If you weren't near the spaceport, you could even forget the galaxy had come calling. But this was Shil. If there was a better example than Bodin naming his restaurant Human Food, one didn't come to mind. There was a peculiarity to Shovanti culture that hadn't been readily apparent back on Earth. Tom was fairly certain that it had to do with the Shovanti sense of permanence. It was an underlying trait in their outlook, walking hand in hand with the Eternal Empress, manifest destiny, and a sense of rightness he suspected that he'd only scratched the surface of. Still, some things stood out, such as place names, but Moscow had not become Kalistagrad. Washington hadn't turned into Kamaleshville. The Shovanti did not rename things. Ever. Or they might change if a place gained patronage, like Empress Zarika's or Sorgo Academy. There were endless hospitals and schools where some noble gave their name to posterity. And fine, the Shovanti had an imagination. Miv and Leia got very imaginative behind closed doors, but their imagination was constantly at war with their sense of permanence. In a culture as old as the Imperium, that made for some idiosyncrasies. Whenever Miv and Leia wanted to eat Shil instead of human, their favourite cafe was the Agrastori Armory. It even served a decent breakfast, as long as you told the waiter to hold the plover. The building was old. Not so old as the Academy, but old enough that it was made from some brick-like ceramic that predated their purple wonder metal. The armory featured wide circular tables set along long galleries. With a little imagination, Tom can envision the firing ranges they'd been over 2 centuries ago. The scorch marks on the walls helped. A long-forgotten base that had been sold to the public, the armory had been 3 different restaurants, 2 offices, a medical clinic, a shoe shop, and half a dozen other things he couldn't remember. Regardless of the function, it was still known as the armory. That was simply how it worked. If you were a local, you know what things were and where. If you weren't, you had to learn. The custom had been difficult to wrap his head around. Thankfully, you could search for the services you wanted by Omnipad. Finding a barber had been an exercise. His first try turned out to be an aquarium, while the second sold adult novelties. The laser hair removal shop in Derentori hadn't wandered far from its origins, but it asked twice before sitting down in the chair. It was just one of those things. Just like now. The academic grounds were a bequest from Empress Zerika. The coastal woodlands were a distant extension of the palace lands, including the cathedral, the amphitheatre, and a plethora of supporting buildings. They all retained their original names. It could have been at the cloister, or the rectory, or anything. Tom focused on getting there, and looking like he was having the best day of his life. Why did my wedding reception have to be in the funeral parlour? Tom Steinberg didn't do crowds. Well, crowds were unavoidable on a planet like Shil, but usually there was an exit. Tom saw it, but there was only one way to get the fuck out without looking like a total douche. He watched the reception for a second. It was like, Tom could only describe it as human tradition fed through the Austin Powers filter. Valkyries? He watched 4 of them slip off with some human guy. Whatever. He patted his front pocket. Hey, babe, mind watching the kids? Smoke break. That was Tom and Navy speak for, I need to catch myself before I murder somebody with a spoon, or thereabouts, sometimes with more or less implied violence. Besides, he didn't like the way Lady Dunt Alever kept accidentally brushing against him and feeling his ass. So there he was, leaning against the wall, as he idly contemplated the best way forward. Eventually, Tom knew he was going to need to go back in there, but for now he simply caught his breath and ruined it with cigarette smoke. Nothing to do but enjoy the tranquility and... Is this spot taken? There was a reason Interesting Times was a curse. I'm not playing nursemaid to any Shilvanti who wants to score, politically minded nobles or anything else. Tom snapped. Then he looked and realized who he was talking to. Rabbi Solomon looked vaguely bemused. Sometimes God worked in mysterious ways. Rabbi Solomon, I mean...
You're having a rough time, perhaps?
Rabbi Solomon leaned against the wall and lit a smoke of his own. You don't know the half of it. Tom threw the butt into the road. Smoking wasn't common among Shilvanti, so there wasn't really much else to do with a burnt-down cigarette.
Seemed pretty fine to me, aside from the strange interpretations of human customs.
Rabbi Solomon took a long drag. I don't do crowds well. Tom mildly reminisced, thinking about when life had been simple. Not since the invasion. He side-eyed a passing Shil, mentally daring her to claim it was a liberation. I know nobody's going to come at me with a knife, up here. Tom tapped his head. But down here, the rest of my body's ready. Unfortunately, Tom's work held more than a few knives to deal with.
Have you tried memory therapy?
And lose who I am? Tom lit another cigarette. Good or bad, the idea of... Good or bad, the idea of removing parts of himself didn't sit well with Tom. That PTSD therapy is just a slow suicide.
Possibly.
Rabbi Solomon chucked his cigarette butt down the road.
But if you aren't careful, those cigarettes will kill you first.
Yeah. Better to stay who I am and live 10 years shorter, right? Not that that was much of a risk with imperial medicine. Even a stopped clock was right twice a day. Both men laughed. Tom looked over at the rabbi. Need another body on Friday night? Can't be too many Jews here in Shil. I'll come by for minyan.
Beautiful.
The rabbi tapped his pack and pulled out another smoke. Tom obligingly flicked his lighter a few times before pulling one of his own cancer sticks.
We'll see you at the Interfaith Center.
Can't wait. Both men stood there in silence. At some point, Tom lit another cig, but didn't really smoke it. It was something to do with his hands. In the end, it was Rabbi Solomon who broke the ice.
Want to know something interesting?
Sure.
According to kosher laws, adixi are okay to eat.
That did it. Tom started cracking up. Oh man, Avi's going to love that.
Avi?
My wife. She's an adixi. Tom used to be sure there were laws against eating sentient people, but Jewish law was labyrinthine at the best of times. And then he'd met Pezrin.
Oh!
The rabbi started laughing. Two Shilvanti walked by. Be excusing me, human. Tom and the rabbi both stopped laughing. We can both speak Vatica, Tom said reflexively. Oh, thank the goddess. Judging by their attire, the Shil were from the wedding. Nice wedding, isn't it? Yeah, it's interesting. Nice day, all that jazz. Tom yeeted another cigarette butt into the road. The Shil wrinkled their noses at the smell. Like no wedding I've ever seen. Wasn't it supposed to be a Shil wedding? Maybe a little human flair for good measure. Curiosity got the better of him. Do they do any sort of flower thing at Shil weddings? Flower thing? Yeah. Whoever gets them is supposed to be married next. The girls looked at each other, excitedly, before walking off, giggling.
Ready to head back in?
Rabbi Solomon asked. Yeah, I actually feel better. Tom put his lighter away. I'll call you later. Zinshiki rubbed up against Past and let her asaic flicker under his. Her sisters moved in, surrounding him. The familiarity was fair trade for her departure. Past stammered, but she was already across the room, closing in on her hachakt. It was his wedding, and she owed him the proper attention and deference. Patviri's hachakt was present as well. She would need to give up time as well. If their trading out left Raikishi and Kalis tending to Past all the time, they had no complaints. They weren't stupid. Besides, it was a wedding. A brawl for Past's attention would be unseemly before eating. Her hachakt was trapped by countless noblewomen, proudly introducing their husbands, or single women too hopeful to have tact. Still, there were others who were not overly familiar, and she had watched him circulate through the crowd, particularly the human priests. She slid beside Deshin and Melondi, who spoke in low tones to the twins. Her hearing was acute, and the conversation was revealing. It's more than just finishing each other's sentences, insisted one of the Kerbals. From the inflection, she thought it was Kamara, but it was impossible to be certain. It's showing your habits, too, nodded her sister. You look perfect now that you've meshed your bangs, offered the first. And don't think we didn't notice, added the second. But the way Dissy holds her hands behind her when she talks is a dead giveaway. Either stop doing it, or both of you do it. The first sister shook her head as her twin took over. Then we just thought you were trying to show your chest off. Hey, I do not, Desi frowned. That's just how I stand. Every time, but only you. The first cocked her head. And never give yourself away. Which you just did, the second said emphatically. It was a bit much, but most Shilvanti seemed that way. Hi, Sinshiki, they chorused. Hello. Are you enjoying the reception? Her reply felt effusive, but it remained a wedding, even if no one was being eaten.
It's nice to see you having fun with people, Desi sniffed. I mean, your boyfriend is handsome, right? And the human kids are so cute I could eat them alive. You would not, she frowned indignantly. They're too young. Yeah, sure.
Desi grinned, while the other girls shook their heads. The constant levity was distressing. Why could they never be serious? Still, they were friends. It would never do to show it, as she kept her tone properly neutral and stilled her asiac into third-degree disinterest, refusing to be baited in public. Emotional control was everything, especially given her sisters, particularly in sight of past. People who reacted so emotionally showed a lack of awareness. They felt too much and analysed too little. It was careless. There was no value in emotional displays. It was better to listen, hear what others were saying, and say little, so when you offered your thoughts they carried weight. Weight gave control. The more difficult the situation, the more important control became. Melondi usually seemed to understand. Desi often did. It must be the party, and so many available men.
So, why are you here instead of with past?
Melondi asked, her smile a reasonable facsimile of Desi.
We're glad to have you, but we thought you'd be spending time together. I required space.
She offered a shrug. Space, blurted one of the twins. Her sister carried on, oblivious to the outburst.
You hardly get to see him.
Typical. She used to shun such overt displays, but learned to find them useful. As a Pezrin, she didn't meet Shilvanti expectations. It was acceptable. Being unpredictable offered advantage. Her Hahakt had taught her that. Warwick was unpredictable in his fashion, and it had brought him rewards. Always scrupulous about his appearance to the Shivanti, Warwick seldom engaged in arguments. He claimed it was because he was a first human and had to put his best foot forward. She suspected the truth was admirably disingenuous. Her Hahakt understood the value of deception. From what she'd seen, the elder McClendon did as well. When people became angry or upset, they wanted to argue and vent their frustrations. Her Hahakt understood the power of refusal. By not engaging, he controlled the situations about him. That she'd seen him visibly upset was a testament to their bond. After all, letting your guard down was what family was for. She glanced over at past as Kalis slid in closer.
Usually. It's fine, she said tonelessly. We see each other.
The Shivanti felt too much, and worse, they were incautious. They didn't build proper walls. They attached too easily, accepted too freely, and opened themselves to hurt. Allowing someone inside your defenses was dangerous. Even her Hahak sister failed to appreciate the value of hiding her feelings, though Kalira, with 3 attempts on her life, was learning. Her family had been larger. Her father had not been maimed. Somehow her companions failed to appreciate what a warband meant. They did not understand, yet they were one themselves. Unlike her Hahakt, they did not comprehend the weight of loss.
There is food. I am going to mingle, she offered,
hinting at the importance of the feast. The line departing the chapel meant the food would disappear, and her hands itched for her knife. Frustrating or not, they were friends, and it was proper to be social before gorging, particularly with her Hakak sister and Melondi. Zinchiki hoped she would never need to break their hearts to save their skins. It was galling how often they depended on luck.
Since you don't hunger for food, let me feed on advice.
As another platter was emptied, she turned to Kalira, drawing close.
Trust no one. Not your most grateful adherent. Not your most intimate friend. Not your dearest brother or dearest lover. Trust no one.
Desi scowled, but kept silent. She was growing as a person.
Not even you?
Melondi said, after a thoughtful look.
Zenshiki, I appreciate your advice, but I don't need to be told the obvious. Are you certain?
They needed her, but some other time. Zenshiki flicked her Isaac toward Laurel as she left for the buffet. Desi watched her sister go, shaking her head.
There are times I know what she's thinking, but right now I have nothing.
It wouldn't hurt to be a little less obscure, Melondi offered.
Maybe.
Desi watched Zensiki's tail thrash in dismay at the remains of the banquet.
But sometimes I think that's why she isn't. Now you're being obtuse.
One of the twins cocked her head.
Does she still use your hairbrush? You know she still wanders around in the dark. I swear she scared me to death.
The other scowled.
Barely even dressed, and doing that thing, you know? How not to be seen? I mean, if you could be kind of invisible, wouldn't you try it?
Desi said thoughtfully, but her attention was on her father. He was nearby, talking with Professor Ramirez. Drink in hand, the elderly professor had cozied up to Tom. It was good to see him in the company of other men, particularly with so many women circling about, as she cocked her head to listen.
And a Ken, that's a braw lass, but you best be careful. Monet, that Quin'll give you mair than bruises.
Professor Ramirez was usually easier to understand, but she heard her father's reply. Maybe, Charmer, but I love to watch her strut.
Aye, that lass has a fine ass.
He swelled slightly before carrying on.
If I were younger...
She'd heard the rumours about Ramirez. There was a picture of him from his younger days, and he had been... maybe 40 years younger. But to hear her father talk that way... Desi felt herself blush. A memory from the other reception floated to mind, dancers and all. What was it that...
Who is that? She said,
nodding across the hall. A tall human boy with a long black braid stood by the door. Dressed in the Vascon fashion, he wore a short black coat embroidered with blue patterns reminiscent of the sea, and was flanked by a tall Chavanti girl and a red-headed Urbian, whose long ears stood as tall as he did. They looked her own age, and...
Oh, him? You need to get out of the museum more. Kazan and I saw him in human food last weekend, but you can forget about it. That pair gars him like Rabbit Grinshaw.
The room was filled with unfamiliar humans, but they were older, save for the boy. Desi cocked her head at Kamara's admission.
Still, I suppose they made their point.
Desi, can we go? Melondi said, interrupting her thoughts.
Now, please?
Desi followed her glance to the prince and the duchess as they made their way toward her father.
Sure. Don't you want to talk to your brother?
Not with her there. She became his handler years ago. There was an opening after that whole mess with Camordra's agents. Melondi grimaced slightly. We've never gotten along. Besides, I shouldn't be seen.
Yeah. Sorry, I was lost in thought.
Desi nodded, toward the decimated buffet.
Let's see if there's anything left to eat.
Mr. Desare's buffet would never feed a party this size. He disappeared into the kitchen and refused to come out. Vadim had gone after him and hadn't returned. It was a man thing, and seemed better not to ask.
Yeah, come on, girls. Last one there has to fight off Zenshiki. That's not funny.
Lady Wikama's frown set another woman off. It was a good frown, something she perfected in the Marines. It saw little use these days, but in present company. With her on Monsignor Barcio's left and Dame McGann to his right, she had every intention of keeping him safe. And the day had been lovely. Kalira kept her distance, but she caught her eye once or twice. She looked happy.
I hope you enjoyed the wedding.
Magand asked. Monsignor Barcio, Santino, as she was pleased to call him privately, offered a serene nod.
It's very different from my faith,
he replied quietly, gesturing to others from the mission.
From all of ours, in truth, yet it captured the sense of the moment, despite the embellishments.
Yes, embellishments, Wakama offered, as an awkward silence fell. The moaning notwithstanding. I heard the most marvellous thing, Monsignor, Magand asked brightly. The woman who gets the flowers will be the next one married?
Ah, see.
He beamed at them both.
Yes, a recent tradition, but one that brings much joy.
How interesting. Wakama glared as another woman came too close. The funeral parlour was a lovely venue, but not meant for a crowd this size, and women kept drawing close. Eavesdropping was a terrible habit, and some were hanging on Barcio's every word. Tom wasn't sure what to make of the situation, but he did his best. Miv, Leia, and Lani were keeping an eye on him, but Shilvanti receptions were long, and as the blushing groom, he seemed he was obliged to meet everyone. He'd bumped more noble fists in the last hour than since the pre-term party, his first week on Shil. It was one thing to have an imperial princess as a student. He'd grown to adore Melondi before finding out she was Kalira, and most of the time she was just that, one of his students. In the school uniform she blended in. But a royal couple dressed for the occasion? Not so much. Prince Laral was easy to like. Tom saw the news. He knew who Laral was and what he'd lost. After a formal introduction by his wife, Laral went through the expected pleasantries. His suit was dark amethyst with polished obsidian studs, and it put Tom's to shame. He was a prince, so Tom tried not to mind. He mostly succeeded. But Din was a good teacher, and he offered what he hoped were the appropriate compliments. His wives held back and smiled indulgently. People kept their distance, which made for a welcome relief. Duchess de Seren was tall and elegant. Her silver hair shone in long braids that probably cost someone hours. She stood close by, letting them talk. Laral apologized for their unexpected arrival and offered congratulations. His questions skirted around Kalira, but he asked how he found teaching humanity.
I understand your marriage to Lady Pelaphon was quite something.
Laral canted his head delicately to one side.
And so many of your people here too. How are you finding a traditional wedding?
It's intrusive, too long. I feel like a side of beef. Interesting, Tom offered after a moment. The cathedral was lovely. We were lucky to get it on Draffel's day.
Oh, that was romantic.
Laral's smile was warm, though he glanced off to one side.
Is this young man part of your family?
Tom followed the look to see Eli McClendon bearing down on him unsteadily. Solana Dasari was coming up behind, and her smile was brittle as chipped glass.
Hey, Professor. Hi there.
Tom felt his stomach sink, as Eli seemed to notice Prince Laral for the first time.
Hi.
Your Highness, may I present Eli McClendon? His family is visiting Shil.
It's a great party. I just wanted to say it's a great party. I was so wrong.
Eli's Vatica was iffy at the best of times. As he leaned forward, Tom noticed his eyes were red.
I thought you were so uptight and
Eli drew himself upright and slipped into English.
So, I'm fine. How are you?
Tom took a sniff, but there was no hint of booze. Burdin had stocked the bar with human wines and some beer. It was a meagre selection, but Eli only wobbled there, clutching a plate of brownies. I'm fine, thanks. I'm glad you could join us today. Tom tried not to sound brittle and almost succeeded. And Solana, I see you're looking after him. Could you give us a few minutes? Yes, over there, at the horizon, is where I would like you to please fuck off. Solana's look of utter mortification was just how Tom felt, but she slipped an arm around Eli and tugged him away. I thought he was a tight ass, but he's alright. Hey, where are we going? Tom thanked any deity that might be listening that Eli was using English, and turned back to Laurel with a sickly grin. Kids and weddings. Two of the most important things, Laurel agreed quietly. Even affairs of state have the occasional upset. Well, this is supposed to be a happy occasion. Let's not bicker and argue about who killed who. Tom smiled before chiding himself. There was no chance they'd get the joke.
Pleasure in humour? The Duchess spoke up. Laurel and I were surprised to learn you have one as a student.
Human, actually. Tom felt the conversation going off the rails. No amount of coaching from Bading could explain Monty Python. Human humour.
How unconventional, but we're used to unusual remarks from our dear Adam. Your people remain a rarity, and this is the first time we've met human clergy.
Her smile faltered as she looked behind him.
But we must be going. I'm sure we'll see you again.
The U-turn into Saren's behaviour caught Tom by surprise, and he was startled to see another human at his side. After a moment, he placed the man, Tom Steinberg. They traded texts, and no other human would have an Adixie family, but they're not being properly introduced. You know each other?
Distantly.
Saren's smile didn't reach her eyes.
But we must be going. Mr. Warwick has been educational.
Tom watched as the Duchess shepherded her husband through the sea of guests, who parted like the Red Sea. The tranquility left with them, and more women were eyeing him than he'd liked. At least Eli was gone, and the less said, the better. Zechariah had stepped in, and Tom could see him having a few words. Something for later, if he wanted to be indelicate. Eli invited indelicate, but not today. Not at his wedding. Mr. Steinberg, I presume? Tom offered his hand and felt relief when the other man took it. Call me Tom, he replied. Same. Warwick noticed the handshake was firm, but not hard. Tom hated the hardest grip nonsense. As married men, at least they didn't have to engage in some ritual dick-beating contest. Glad you can make it. I haven't seen this many humans since I left Earth. Yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing. Steinberg's grin was wry, and he nodded at the priests scattered throughout the crowd. I kind of hang with a group, but unfamiliar faces are sort of a novelty. Well, I appreciate you coming. I'd like to talk about my class once all this is over. The World War thing? Appreciate the invite. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Steinberg gave him a wintry smile, but it brightened after a moment. Appreciate today, too. I haven't been out to the mission, and talking to Rabbi Solomon meant a lot to me. Better luck than judgment. I was asked to help them settle in, but it sort of fell to a friend of a friend. Tom looked around at the milling crowd of women. Golden eyes were watching like hawks. Look, I don't want to cut this short, but traditional wedding or no, I'm getting kind of a weird vibe. Steinberg shook his head. Yeah, folks will be talking about this for years. Great. I can look forward to the video. Let's get to the door. Tom's sigh was quiet but heartfelt, and they pushed their way through. No one pinched his ass, but he hadn't felt this nervous since he faced Nshiki's family. He waved to his ladies and pointed to the exit. Since I'm to be the belle of the ball, I'm going to get us out of here. They can say I'm a nervous groom or something, but I'm cutting my losses before something makes headlines. Besides the prince and his wife? Steinberg snorted. I think the reporter's already got you covered. Yeah, brilliant. Tom's smile faltered, and he clutched his coffee. He'd had enough of smiling, too. Everyone would love the traditional wedding. It couldn't help people's view of humans, but he was tired of smiling for people he didn't know. "All right, ladies, gather around." He took off the wreath of flowers and looked it over. He had removed his sword before the reception, but somehow the silly thing had stayed on his head. "I'm deeply touched by the moment, but feel a bit fatigued." There were murmurs, probably sympathy for the poor, overwrought male. "My wives and I thank you for joining us. It's been quite the surprise." And wasn't that the truth? Still, it was nearly over. The Tao had provided. "I just want to leave you with one thing." Thomas held the flowers up high as women pressed forward, secretaries mixing with nobles in a growing knot of Shilvanti womanhood. "Humans have a tradition where—" A woman yelled, "It's mine!" Then the crowd charged. Deshin lay down to sleep and dozed. What a day! Father was alive. He began fuming as soon as he got home, but he'd managed. Her mother's had more than a few choice words. She'd expected Selani's language to be colourful, but Mever and Shalea had managed. No one tackled him, as such. It was a misunderstanding, and in the excitement, he'd never thrown the flowers. His poor suit! The Tharios would try, but between the tears and all the stains, it was probably beyond saving. He nearly escaped too. He nearly made the footpath before slipping on the grass and tumbling into the wall. Women closed in, uncertain what to do and unwilling to lay hands on him, yet just unwilling to give up the wreath. Then the fight started. At least he finally dropped it when Lani carried him off. She smiled in drowsy recollection. Lark had it all on camera. Unfortunately, so did the reporters, but it was an innocent misunderstanding. It could have happened to anyone. Well, maybe not. Tipsy or not, Professor Hamera still left with 3 women from the palace. Her mother was right. His accent really did get worse. Thoughts flickered past as her mind drifted. Thoughts of Melondi. I don't need to be told the obvious. It was a shame she could never relax and just be Kalira. They'd gotten so many stares, looking alike. Why couldn't she just enjoy her family? We've never gotten along. It reminded her of Durale Aterak. She'd been Kamordre's handler before she'd been killed. Everyone had suspected Agent Zariva, but it had never been proven. Eterak's widow had pointed fingers, but the investigation never went anywhere. The tide pool had been interesting. The night Liam danced, and they'd met Jama Hamerez. He'd heard Eterak's dying words. She'd met someone with silver hair. There was an opening after that whole mess with Kamordre's agents. She rolled fitfully as sleep eluded her. Hamerez had shaken his head. She couldn't barely speak, but it sounded like she was saying, "Dancer, dancer." Zariva had an alibi. So did the dancers at the tide pool. Hamerez had been out in the town. His accent grew worse when he drank. Did his comprehension suffer? Deshin bolted upright. "Das Seran!"